I'm going to offer us some, I guess, preliminary observations and conclusions about the contributing role of social media to the uprisings that have swept the Middle East in the past few months. Before I get into that, one of the distinguishing characteristics, as has been alluded to before, is the change in the nature of the revolutionaries themselves. When we think about revolutionaries, the past 30 years or so, we've thought about older people, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Okay? What really distinguishes what's happening in the Middle East right now is the youth of the protesters. If I had to come up with a title for this novel, it would be The Young and the Restless. And the leaders that are emerging in these different places, it's really astounding. At a place like Yemen, there's a young female leader of this revolution named Tawakkul Karman. And of all the places in the world where we would expect a young female revolutionary to emerge, Yemen would not have been tops on my list. In terms of what these uprisings are about, I won't get into too much to Khaled Zaid because Ahmed talked about it. But if I could just summarize, it's largely about exclusion from political and economic power. It's less about democracy than it is about a feeling that state power is being exercised arbitrarily, and that people don't have a voice in their day-to-day affairs, and they don't have any recourse when the state does something to them that they don't like. So these sort of formal democratic practices about elections and things like that are important, but are less important than issues of torture, detainment, due process, things like that. Okay. When we think about digital activism, what we call digital activism in authoritarian countries, I like to think about this systematically, which is what are the things that digital technologies do for dissidents in authoritarian countries. Okay. One of those things is the creation of an alternative public sphere. And this comes out of Habermas, and this is the creation of sites where people can express themselves, where they can organize dissent, and where they can weigh in on public affairs. Okay. A journalist friend of mine in Egypt calls this voices for the voiceless. He said, in Egypt, we didn't have a voice before the internet. And the internet gives me a voice, gives my friends a voice. Perhaps more importantly, is a reduction of the costs of organizing collective action in an authoritarian context. The internet allows you to reduce the cost of forming a group to basically nothing beyond the cost of internet access itself. And that's not inconsequential, but it's nearly costless. Okay? And it allows you to transmit your information, your ideas, your calls to action, instantaneously to all corners of your social network. So when you change a profile picture on Facebook, that's sending a message, right? I support something. I support the April 6th movement. I support universal health care. Okay? And all 700 of your friends, all of a sudden, know what you think. And in authoritarian societies, that's not a small thing. Okay? The problem when you're trying to organize dissent in a place like Egypt is uncertainty about the intentions and beliefs of others. Other people who might potentially join you, but you do not know whether they agree with you or not, whether they also want to see change. And over the past few years, as more and more people have gotten online, even in developing countries, through informal practices, through internet cafes, through cell phones, the statistics on internet access really vastly underestimate the number of people that can get online. Okay? This has vastly increased the value of the communication networks that they're taking part in. And this comes out of Reed's Law. Reed's Law says that the more people you have in a network, the more useful it is. If I was the only cell phone user in this room, my cell phone would be quite useless. But when every one of my friends has a cell phone, the cell phone suddenly becomes incredibly important and a potential tool for action. And I think what's going on here in these sort of sudden revolutionary moments is what we call in the social sciences an informational cascade. A sudden mass change in preferences or beliefs that appears sudden, but is actually related to the revelation of private information. You know, my preferences about political order that only I know, but that I'm now revealing to other people on the internet. So when these digital activists plotted the January 25th protests in Egypt, they got tens of thousands of people committed to going out in the streets. And that's a big deal in a place where you could be arrested, tortured, or worse for doing this kind of thing. They knew that they would not be alone, and that was incredibly important. Critically, this cost nothing. No leaflets needed to be printed up. It was an instantaneous call to action. I would also argue, so we're sharing some slides here. This is Imad al-Kabir again. I would also argue that the Egyptian revolution is the world's first surveillance revolution. Surveillance is the inversion of surveillance, what I like to call the watching of the watchers by the watched. And the practices that evolved in Egypt over the past 4 or 5 years were incredibly important contributing factors to this revolution. And what happened was, this video actually was taken by a fellow police officer in a practice where torturers would pass videos of the people that they were torturing to one another to have a laugh. Look what we did, right? But this case that Ahmed talked about instigated a whole movement where people would take pictures of people being beaten, detained, mistreated, and post them on the internet. And the untold story of Khaled Said, whose Facebook group helped contribute to this revolution, is that Khaled Said was killed for committing an act of surveillance. Khaled Said posted a video on the internet of police divvying up a drug bust. That's the reason he was killed. That's why he was dragged out of his internet cafe and beaten to death in full view of all the onlookers. And they dumped his body with his family, and they said, Khaled Said died of swallowing a bag of marijuana. Okay, and I'm not going to show you the pictures because this is a family event, but it was very obvious that this man did not die of swallowing a bag of marijuana. Okay? And in the digital age, it becomes much harder for the regime to tell you that up is down and down is up than it used to be. And surveillance is not easy for the state to shut down. You can go after an individual person posting things on the internet. You can take down their page, but somebody else will put it right back up. Somebody else will put it up on YouTube. And these are all technologies, new applications and sites that have emerged in the last few years. A friend of mine asked, what was John Kerry's YouTube strategy in 2004? Didn't have one because there was no YouTube. Applications are emerging continuously that upend our understandings of what is and is not possible in these contexts. But of course, regimes are not powerless in the face of this kind of mobilization. And people often ask, why did Tunisia and Egypt succeed, where Bahrain and Syria and Algeria seem to have failed? Right? And that's where we bring the political science back in. And we say, protest is fine, mobilization is fine, but you are going to encounter entrenched structures of authoritarianism that are not necessarily amenable to mass protest. What changed, people have been protesting in Egypt for years. What changed was they took it to direct action. Protest is you go out in the street and you express dissent. Direct action is you go and occupy the provost's office until you get what you want. And this is what the Egyptians did. I don't know if that's still possible. But, and it does not appear that even direct action will necessarily be enough to dislodge authoritarian structures in all of these countries. And that should not, I think, give us a reason to throw up our hands and say that digital activism is useless, or Facebook is useless, or the regime will always win. But to really understand the things that the technologies can do, which is to organize protests, to communicate, to agree on frames and calls to action, and to also understand their limitations. You can't overthrow Assad in Syria just with Facebook alone. Other things have to happen. Army units need to defect. There need to be fissures and splits within the regime. Right? This all comes out of the democratization literature that's been developing over the last 30 years. And these are all really important things to keep in mind as we move forward. That's the monument that the protesters in Bahrain erected, and then the regime tore it down. And what better symbol, what more depressing symbol of the power that these regimes still possess than that incident. So I'm actually, my 10 minutes of fame are up, so I'm going to end it there and turn it over to our next panelist. Thank you.